Muito boa tarde a todos. Good afternoon. Cabe-me apresentar o professor Geert Bouckaert. Vou fazê-lo com muito poucas palavras. Ele não precisa de apresentação. Vou fazê-lo em inglês. Atenção ao professor Bouckaert, mas de forma muito breve, não é? So, we are honored to have among us Professor Geert Bouckaert. Everybody knows Professor Bouckaert. Anyway, it is important to emphasize that he is one of the leading personalities in the world of public administration. That means administrative science, theory of the state, and so on in our days. His works have marked for long teaching and research in this area, and his publications are translated in many languages and are available in many countries. Professor Bouckaert has been here for some days, and he has been teaching public administration, public management in the context of our Master of Public Administration. Now we have the hypothesis, the opportunity, the great opportunity to have this conference. I'm sure that all of us, people who are here, and those ones that follow us on Zoom, YouTube, and whatever, there were more than 700 inscriptions, 700 participations. Let's see how many we have, but lots of people will listen to Professor Bouckaert, and I'm sure everybody will have the opportunity to learn something, to learn a lot about what is today, what is our contemporary public administration, what are the characteristics, what are the challenges, main challenges, the relations between the relations, the public administration, the society, and the state. So, thank you, dear Professor Geert Bouckaert. Thank you, dear Geert, dear friend, for this opportunity, and please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Joan, for this nice introduction. And I must say I'm very pleased and feel very honored to be at this institute here and talk not just to those here in the room, but also all those that are attending in a virtual way to this speech. It shows how times are changing, and what you see is not what you get. You know, from that point of view, I think the world is really changing. And sometimes, so I have been teaching students from the master, and I must say I've been very impressed by their knowledge and their eagerness to understand how things are moving in the world. And sometimes I use a kind of metaphor to show how public sector management and the state is changing. I'm sure you know this Olympic discipline of clay shooting. You have a cannon and a hunter, and the clay moves, and then you have to try to shoot the clay. Sometimes I compare public sector reform, state reform as clay shooting, but then with the condition that everything is moving. It's not just the clay, it's also the cannon, it's the one who shoots, and it's the environment. And sometimes when we start looking and trying to understand reforms, all these dimensions are really interfering. And so the question is, how do we handle that? I think from a Portuguese point of view, you are very well skilled to understand that the current scenery of state reform and public management reform is extraordinarily dynamic. And of course, we could mention the different crises which our governments have to cope with. It's not just the terrorist issue, but it's also, and I know you've been very suffering from this, the financial and the banking crisis in 2008. But we could also refer to Fukushima, which was an extraordinary combination of unexpected issues. COVID obviously is still there around, even if we could try to contain it to a certain extent. We have Ukraine. I think I don't have to explain that. And on top of that, we have floodings and fires. You have been suffering from fires too. There's the migration issue, there's the energy crisis, all of that together. And so I think it's something we have to look at when we look at what are the capacities and the skills of a state and a public sector to be able to handle this. The second thing for governments to do is the tensions to deliver services. And again, I can refer to your country to say that in many cases, the macroeconomic logics, Brussels, the Troika, have taken over agendas, national agendas, and overruled capacities to deliver services. I think, in a way, it's a terrible situation, which we have to look at how to handle this too. And I think I have a lot of sympathy for the way Portugal has been treated and had to handle these challenges. There is the innovation issue. Of course, nobody's against digital innovation, but the question is here again, not if it's desirable, but to what extent it is feasible in complex societies and divided societies, and how we combine it with social innovation, because it's not just digital innovation. And the question is, how should we be fit for purpose for the future? And all these things together have to be managed and governed in one way by our states in general. And my point of view will be an OECD point of view and a European point of view. And the question is, what lessons can we learn from the past? But I think a crucial question is, can we keep the solutions of the past? Don't we have to reinvent our solutions? And my point of view of the big point I'm trying to make in this speech is to say that we probably cannot copy paste the solutions of the past. We will have to reinvent some solutions and invent some new types of solutions. And I will make some very concrete proposals here with some impacts on how we have to reorganize our systems to be fit for purpose for the future. But to put it in a cultural context, let me actually refer to one of your poets. And I let you the time to read it. The ship sails on. Beneath the clear water, the fine sand of the ocean floor can be seen. Impeccable wayfaring figure, the limitless distance that lies between. And then comes the drama. And sigh begins to plumb, rebuild, compare. So many shipwrecks, so much ruin and loss. Oh, dazzling vision, oh, beautiful lie. I'm not sure if you recognize it. It's from Venus, from Clepsydra of Camillo Pessanha. I think it's interesting that I think he wrote this poem for our speech here, actually for the public management reform. It looks, you know, when I say we need new types of solutions, you can have your ship sailing and say, oh, everything is all right and the water is clear. But when you look very well, you actually see the shipwrecks. And I think you have experience as a country of shipping and shipbuilding and naval forces. You know what shipwrecks are. And the shipwrecks come not just from the sea now, but they come from continental Europe to a certain extent. And so the question is that we will have to change a paradigm. The normal previous paradigm is actually kind of sequential thinking. So we have standard operating procedures, normal operations. Then we have a crisis which needs to be handled. Then we have to recover. And then we come back to new normal. We call it new normal now, normal between brackets. And then there is a new crisis which we need to handle, and we recover, and we have another normal. It's a kind of sequential thinking. And it's interesting to see we have been organizing our public sectors, our states, in this sequential matter. Standard operating procedures, and then, you know, suddenly a little of a shake-up, which we have to handle, and then we try to get back to normal. I think this is an old paradigm. I think from now on, we should anticipate and prepare our public spheres and our public systems, our whole of government, as part of a whole of society system in a simultaneous way. So we will have a kind of layer where we will have to ensure service delivery and try to keep that as normal as possible, but it will be a kind of recurrent chronicle crisis governance. And I think I mentioned the crisis at the beginning, so there will be a kind of need to anticipate and reorganize our structures and our capacities to simultaneously handle crisis with service delivery. And so from that point of view, we said we are from the sequential to a simultaneous type of thinking to make our systems fit for purpose. And that's a totally different design, which we have to accept and which we have to anticipate. It requires a change in the policies, in the decision-making, in allocating capacities, and I think in the way of the way political and administrative relationships should be organized. Also, how the public sector should be transforming to a public service in a whole of society context. So that's a quite different picture which we have to be aware of. So combining service delivery and standard operating procedures with chronicle crisis governance will be the next design and the next paradigm which we will have to prepare for. And so if we look at the major targets for the public sector, it's these three crucial elements from a public sector point of view. And of course, it's in a kind of democratic rule of law context, hopefully, and I will emphasize that in the next slides too. It's delivering routine services. We're talking about health and education and environment, safety, all these delivering routine services simultaneously with solving expected crisis and unexpected crisis. And the third one, to be able to combine these two of service routines, delivering routine services and solving unexpected and expected crisis, we will have to innovate. We will have to organize experiments and see how they are sustainable and try to use these futures, to reinvent these futures through experiments to deliver the services and to govern the crisis in a way. And the real context, I'm sure you know all these expensive words here, we are in volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous contexts. So the volatility will increase, and this volatility will require an immediate result, will impact our decision making. So there will be an impact on decision making as a consequence of this volatility. Where we used to work with risk and audit risk, we will have to shift to uncertainty and uncertainty is a different type of thinking compared to risk. Risk we can calculate, we can take a risk, so to speak, but uncertainty creates a lot of difficulties in organizing systems, and to handle uncertainty is actually a different category compared to handling risks. The complexity will increase, and the complexity will have an impact on the back offices, which will have to integrate and collaborate. To reduce complexity will be a challenge, and how to do that. That will require a lot of data and information, which we share. So the sharing of information will become a crucial element too. And of course, ambiguity, because there is no such a thing as a single problem with a single solution and a one-to-one relationship between the problem and the solution. So this ambiguity is an element which we have to handle too. And from that point of view, where we are reasoning from a problem to a solution, we actually will have to reverse it and think from solutions generating new problems, and to anticipate that, and to look how solutions generate new problems, and to anticipate on that too. I think these are elements which I will discuss now to see how that will run. Delivering routine services. Obviously, the digital agenda will be very prominent, and the question is, and the virtuality will be something we will have to put in all our service deliveries, whether it's education like what we have today, but also health, the health agenda, diagnosing at a distance. Also security will be impacted by digital. I think the digital agenda will require a lot of efforts to have legal frames, obviously, and we will have to rearrange our audits based on that. I think we are absolutely not fit for purpose at this moment to audit artificial intelligence and the algorithms used to see what the biases are and the reliability of the algorithms. Connecting databases will be crucial. The whole issue of cloud governance is a huge difficulty, with a different point of view in the US compared to the European Union. And it has to do with the relationship of an individual in the position of an individual in the cloud and the position of an individual in an entity. I think in the US there are different visions on how to protect an individual, and I think that's an important element, and the European Commission is already working to develop standards and trying to create legal frames, but it's an element which is not ready yet. We are not ready at this moment to try to look at it, and the cloud governance will be a challenge which we have to put as soon as possible in an expansive way on our agenda. The second thing is the shift from public sector to public service. And also here, it's about the capacity of the public sector to have partnerships. It's clear OECD has always promoted partnerships, and the question is, societal partnerships will have to be further developed. And whereas we have been talking about public-private partnerships, it could be that it's the other way around, that it's private-public partnerships. And then the whole issue will be, how can we organize responsibility and accountability mechanisms, not to lose control, and to make sure it remains transparent and performing and functional when we have to move to private-public partnerships rather than public-private partnerships. So the question is, who takes the lead, and how do we organize responsibility and accountability mechanisms? A third agenda point for delivering routine services is clearly, and it has been the SDG agenda from the United Nations, but the United Nations is in New York, far away, but it comes very close when we have to apply and use the SDGs as a guideline for our strategies country strategies, leaving no one behind. I think we are all aware that our political systems are being affected by considerable parts of society that feel abandoned. It could be rural based, city versus rural. It could be ethnic based. It could be religious based. It could be age related, but there are feelings of abandonment, and the strategy to deliver services to those that are entitled to have the services, of course, in the leaving no behind strategy. So it should be very explicit in the delivery. Access to services becomes very important. The OECD has changed its monitoring systems to also look at access in the context of leaving no one behind. And access, they define it not just in financial terms, but also in geographical terms and in information terms. So people should have access on the information. It should be relatively close geographically, and it should be accessible financially. The leaving no one behind will again be an important element. Equal treatment is another challenge, and I think the way of reorganizing service delivery in a virtual way should also allow us to pay attention to issues of the citizen as a customer of services and the variety of target groups. And then, you know, whereas virtuality allows tailor-made services, or much more tailor-made services, the issue of equality and equal treatment will become an issue. And so you will see that tensions will emerge in the delivery of services from that point of view. Also, the contracting out will, again, we've been talking about the partnerships, but the contracting out issue will be important too. And I think this is not a technical discussion, it's also an ideological discussion, obviously. And I think the issue of having debates on what can be contracted out and not will further and more explicitly come on our agendas in the public sector in the European Union. And I think the whole, sometimes I say, the thought experiment could be that in principle we could contract out, then only one thing remains, the activity of contracting out, which we also can contract out. And so that leads to a hollow state. And we all know what happens to hollow trees. So I think we need to have a very explicit agenda on what we want to keep in the public sphere and what we want to put as part of contracts on the market. And I think it's this is a crucial political debate. Ultimately, it's also a pragmatic debate of resources and what we can afford to do. And the conclusion is actually here that for delivering routine services, the layers of government which we have, central, intermediate, and local, will have to integrate one way or another. Of course, we will keep these layers, but the back offices of these layers will have to integrate. And together, you know, to create a kind of shared back office as a whole of government strategy will then be better to, let's say, connected to a whole of society context. That's the routine service delivery which we have to ensure. So there will be new challenges here which have not, they already are announced, and most of it we see it already, but it will become more explicit and more pronounced. The second tough issue is solving or handling or containing crisis, expected and unexpected. And I think it's quite obvious to refer here to the 17 SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. In a way, if we cannot manage the 17 SDGs, they all have the potential to lead to uncontrollable, unmanageable crisis. I think, of course, we focus in many cases on planet, and it's not a coincidence, I guess, that SDG number 13, the unlucky number, is climate. Climate is SDG 13, the unlucky number. And I think, of course, planet is one of them, but it's not just planet, it's also people. And people, as I said, it's about inclusion or exclusion here of different parts of the society. And I think that will be an element that impacts decision-making and the political systems. And the third piece, so people and planet, it's prosperity. Prosperity is, of course, a crucial element of the SDGs, which we have to realize by 2030. So it's 7 years to go. And the prosperity, so it's not profit, it's prosperity. And that's a crucial difference to define. Prosperity is a much larger concept than just profit. And the fourth and the fifth P are peace and partnerships. I would like to draw your attention on the partnerships. It's SDG 17. SDG 17 partnerships, you would expect partnerships to be just a kind of technique or a vehicle to do something else. And this is not the case for the SDGs. SDG 17 partnerships is actually a sustainable development goal by itself. And that's quite remarkable. So we need to have partnerships as a sustainable development goal. Why is this so important? To contain crisis, but also for service delivery? Because partnerships in a society allow to make synergies of resources and capacity. And because these partnerships also can be developed in a trustworthy context. So trust is becoming very important here. To realize the partnerships, we will have to have trust in society, in communities, not just trust of society in the public sector, but also the trust of the public sector in society, and also trust within the public sector, which is not so obvious to realize, apparently. And so based on the issue of trust, partnerships become a crucial, not just instrument, but become an objective to realize other SDGs here. The two other horizontal, so it's a horizontal SDG. The two other horizontal ones are SDG 11 and 16. 11 is on strong local communities. And so here you will get the agenda of decentralization. And I understand that Portugal probably could use a bit more decentralization here. And I'm not sure if everybody agrees on that, but we can discuss that. To make strong local governments is an agenda for the future in many OECD countries in general, but in the European Union in particular. We have been involved in studies on measuring autonomy of local governments, and we need not just capacity, but also the autonomy to run and to use the capacity of local governments as local communities. And that's a crucial part in the developments. But it's also so SDG 11, strong local communities, is crucial. SDG 16 is also a horizontal one, which you have to keep in mind. It's on strong institutions. It also refers to peace and to justice. But the strong institutions are important, again, for effective policies and accountability here. And I think it's an important element to emphasize that. An element here is also the fragile and failed states. In former times, we just saw that on television. That was far away from Europe. But nowadays, that's not the case anymore. We see the impact of fragile and failed states, which are in the neighborhood countries and in continents which are rather close, but sometimes not so close. It results in migration waves. It results in climate impacts, but fragile and failed states suddenly become quite close. And again, we will have to have policies to handle that, to prevent it as much as possible, to anticipate that, and to try to control this. And finally, the word wickedness is a crucial word here too. And that's the shift from risk to uncertainty. So this is like a second portfolio of elements which future states and future public sectors will have to take into account, and to do that in combination with the routine service delivery. The third element is innovation, and innovation is actually, needed to run the first and the second part, to run the ensuring service delivery, and to try to run the problems of the crisis and govern the crisis. We will have to have innovation, not just innovation in the public sector, but innovation in society. This is not just about digital innovation, as I have mentioned before. It's also about social innovation. How can we reinvent partnerships? How can we co-design policies? How can we co-decide on measures? How can we co-produce services? How can we co-evaluate in our complex societies? The European Commission is emphasizing this participatory democracy agenda. I think it comes high on the agenda for political reasons. I think it needs to be complemented by collaborative governance. Collaborative governance will be needed to maintain the legitimacy of our systems. The legitimacy of our systems is not just a legal issue. It's not just, ensuring a service delivery. The legitimacy will also be endorsed by a co-ownership and the partnerships which we can ensure in our decision making. I think that's a crucial element that we will have to pay attention to, and that has been not enough developed. That requires legal frames, as I mentioned, not just for the digital cloud governance, but also legal frames to organize responsibility mechanisms and accountability mechanisms for our partnerships. I think that's not, and our networks. I think that's not an obvious thing to do, but we should be creative there. I will show you two scenarios in a way to look into the future and to see what futures could come and absorb us. The first one, and I will start with a negative version, a dystopian version of the futures that could come, and that in some cases have some presence already. This is a quadrant which has two lines, of course, and it's on futures of legal systems. So when you anticipate legal systems, it takes time to rewrite legal systems, constitutions, and general legal frameworks. The question for the future will be, will our future legal systems be more public or more private legal systems? And the second angle is, will there be more national legislation or international legislation? And we can combine them into four quadrants. And there are two graphs of this. There is a dystopian version, which we don't want, of course, and there is a utopian version, which has some positive connotations. I will expand on these elements here. First, the axis, more public legal systems or more private legal systems. I think it's very obvious what you observe in these days in the European, continental Europe, certainly, is that we see a kind of invasion of private law in the public sphere. We see it for labor, in the labor market, hiring civil servants, the pension systems. You see an enormous invasion of private law in the public sphere. You also see it in the issue of service delivery itself. Contract management becomes a very strong vehicle to organize service delivery. I think that's an element which we should not underestimate. And the element is, of course, which courts will be relevant, and how can citizens defend their interests in a way when they are getting services in the public sphere, but it's private law that it's actually shaping these service deliveries. So the private legislation, the private frames, legal frames, are starting to shape the public sphere. And the question is, what are the implications for that? Is that something we want or not? And I think we have to watch these evolutions. The second is national and international law. I think I already emphasized that international legal frames become very important in the digital agendas. It's quite clear that just national legislation is necessary, but absolutely insufficient. We need European frames here and even beyond agreements. And it has to do with cyber security, it has to do with privacy, it has to do with ownership of data, and it has to do with not just investments in cloud, but also the transactions from these clouds. How do we govern that, and what kind of legislation are we going to develop for that? Because it needs to be developed. And so if you look at the four possibilities here of a dystopian legal future, and I think it's the role of the state and the public sector to make sure we have the right legal frames here. But if we go to international and private, we see a situation where we have governed by Google, governed by Google. And I think in some cases, we see already the power of these huge companies, Facebook and Google and others, who become stronger than countries. And the question is, how can we rebalance that? And that could become a nightmare in a way when private owners of these major companies are actually confining using things and limit use and can actually bias the market from that point of view. We have private and national, and that's I already talked about the failed states. And unfortunately, it happens already in some parts of the world, you know, clans, mafia, warlords that get control of huge territories. And I think that's another element that triggers it, creates a domino effect of futures which we don't want and which have impact on us. A centralized world government would be international and public. It would be like the wrong version of the UN, so to speak. And then the public and national could be a very closed nationalistic administrative system. So these are dystopian, but let's go to the positive one, the utopian one. That's what we want to happen. So it means we have to prepare legal frames that facilitate this and that could encourage these four quadrants. I mean, and the question is, again, private, public, and national, international. If we move to international and private, it would be cross-border partnerships across states. And I think it has to do with cooperation, peer-to-peer service delivery. The cross-border elements become very important in the service delivery and go beyond the state borders here and from a partnership point of view. Public and international, it's a UN government. I think the most clear recent example is the SDGs. The decision on the SDGs is a kind of very strong statement to say this is like an agenda, not just like the Millennium objectives, which were only for developing countries, but for the whole world. We share these 17 sustainable development goals. This is like an expression, a strategic expression of a UN government point of view. But we also could move to a private and a national type of legislation. That would be a corporatist state. That's also a reality in certain places. Or we move to a public, a national, but it could also have an international implication, a neo-Weberian state model. So not a classical Weberian state, but a neo-Weberian, which actually is amended and takes into account the partnerships and with civil society, with the market networks and markets, and obviously in a democratic state of law. So these are elements which we also have to anticipate. It may sound abstract, but it's actually much less abstract as you can expect, because there are already fragments of realities in all these elements of the quadrant here. And this has implications. If we look at these three layers, routine service delivery, which we have to reinvent, the crisis governance, which will be recurrent as a second layer in combination, not sequential but simultaneous, and then the innovation strategies which we have to emphasize and organize. This has implications for decision making, for contents of policies, and also for drivers of our systems. I will go through these three implications here to discuss what it could mean. Changing decision making, that's a crucial element. Of course, it should be transparent and it should be legitimate, but there are positive tendencies and there are negative tendencies if you look at decision making here. I think the positive tendencies are, yes, there is we have more participation. You know, we have co-investments, co-production. From the service delivery point of view, it's a clear element, and so this co-decision in the service delivery becomes like obvious, even if it's not easy to organize that. We also see new types of centralization and new types of decentralization. So the word centralization and decentralization are getting different meanings here. And of course, the new centralization can be very tough when it's on debt management and fiscal rules, but there is a kind of mechanism here to look for shared opportunities there. But the new decentralization becomes very important. And that's why I was emphasizing this here too, to have strong local governments. Local governments become a very strong pillar in our future state shaping and public sector definitions here. It's there could be kind of negative element here too, to say, you know, if you transfer more competences than money, it could create a kind of disequilibrium at the local level. But the local government is a crucial element which we have to take into account. The negative strategies in the decision making have to do with referenda, which are manipulated and biased. It has to do with decreased political leadership and populism, which is a fact, becoming a fact. It has to do with direct political communication on decision-making, the so-called Twitter decision-making. It has to do with the fragmentation of political parties. The question is, how do we organize our political parties for the future in the decision-making? And it has to do with polarization, which leads to a kind of conviction that compromise is bad. And I think that is a kind of tendency which needs to be reversed. That's on the decision making. If we look at the contents of policies, also here we see a potential fundamental change. The positive strategies here, or the positive evolutions on the content of the policies, is the recognition of the wickedness of problems and the acceptance to integrate the sustainable development goals into our national strategies. I think many countries, even if they don't use the word sustainable development goal or use explicitly these labels, it is quite clear that it becomes explicitly on the agenda in the European Union and in the countries of the European Union. A second element here is that this connection between global and local, and we see that global problems immediately have an impact at the local level. And that means that's another reason to strengthen local governments, because central governments cannot cope sufficiently with this. Local governments have direct contacts politically and administratively with their citizens, and I think it's an important element to emphasize that. The negative elements on the policies is the saving strategies, that's one, which, savings become in some countries like an objective by itself, up to the point that you get subcritical capacity. And the subcritical capacity has been very clear in the COVID period. It's clear, all the empirical evidence shows that countries that did not do excessive savings and kept their capacity were in a much better position to fight COVID than countries that have really cut resources and capacity without really thinking about it. It has to do with changing terminology too. Slack or excessive capacity is not excessive, it's buffers. To keep buffers in the public sector is essential for sustainability. If you redefine buffers as waste or excess and you save them away, you actually weaken the system here. And so it has happened in many countries, and I think we will have to pay a price for that if it happens here. And I think Portugal has been experiences this unfortunately through the decisions from the Troika here. A second element here is that the welfare state is under pressure, and that could lead to exclusion rather than inclusion. Again, inclusion and exclusion become an element of policies which need to be taken care of. And the feeling of abandonment, I have mentioned that already here. So it could lead to different types of globalization, but also different types of nationalism and regionalism. I think that's an important element which you see even in Europe, where in general big major countries are getting pressured and are getting fragmented. You see the pressure in Spain, but also in the United Kingdom, in Belgium, for that matter. I think it's an important element to be aware that we get new types of nationalism, which actually are converted into regionalism. And that puts a pressure on the policies that need to be developed here. A final point, it's a very important point, it's the blaming, looking for scapegoats. I think most of you will know the expression that once was used by an American president. It's the economy, stupid. I think now this sentence has been modified. Not just it's the economy, stupid, but it's the ecology, stupid. It's the social group, stupid. And so we try to find scapegoats here. And I think that's something which really impacts the policies here. You see, I'm here at the borderline of public administration, public policies, and political science here. But ultimately, we see in convergence, we need to have an academic convergence for these here. And so we move to the third issue of change. So not just decision making, not changes in policies, but the third one is the change of the drivers of the system. And we have been told in the public management reform agenda that markets would save us, that the markets are always right. And that has resulted in the famous new public management agenda that has been dominating reforms in the OECD countries in general and most of the European Union countries in particular. It's an interesting issue to see that this New Zealand model initially was catapulted into Paris at the OECD level and then spread amongst the OECD countries. But it seems that the market is not always right. And the market is not just saving everybody. And so from that point of view, the new public management agenda, which was like a panacea for all the problems, is not a panacea anymore and is not solving all our problems. And so we see a kind of critical assessment of what principles should drive our systems, Of course, we need a market, and of course, we need the private sector, and of course, the market has very beneficial elements, but we cannot apply it to all fields of the public sphere, and that's actually the point we are making here. And the second thing is the networks. Of course, we need networks, and networks have been very functional during the COVID period to fight the crisis, especially at the local level. The communities, strong communities, were beneficial to fight COVID crisis. And we need, not just for crisis governance, also for service delivery. You know, we see strong networks delivering in education or in health or in environmental efforts here. So we need networks desperately, but only networks will not save us neither. And so from that point of view, we could say markets, yes, but we should make sure that they are not deconstructing the administrative state. We should make sure that the consultants, and I'm referring to the last publication of Mariana Mazzucato, that consultants are not taking over government. If you look at the volumes of money that goes to consultants, it's an immense amount of money. And the question is, what do we get in return? And what about just keeping that money and reinvesting it in the public sector rather than giving it to consultants? And so from that point of view, also the issue of deregulated markets can be very dysfunctional. We have to be careful with deregulation here. And it could be limiting access to services if you only have market mechanisms, because the market is about, you know, the capacity to buy services. So we have to have regulations there to make sure there is an inclusive strategy when we use markets. And so the focus on saving strategies, I mentioned it already, when slack is redefined as inefficiencies, or when buffers become redundancy, then of course we have a huge problem for the future. And so the point I'm making here is markets are useful, but we should make it conditional, and the conditions should be strictly defined. We should be very conscious in to know when we use market mechanisms. Networks, again, yes, but we have to make sure that inclusion is there, because networks can also organize exclusions. There is a question of effectiveness when networks become too cosmetic, nice to have, but not very effective. And of course, we have to make sure that networks are not used just for blaming strategies or scapegoat strategies. So in theoretical terms, hierarchies remain very important, and hierarchies are organizations in the public sector based on legal frames, but they should be complemented, of course, with markets and networks. So we have seen, because of the crisis governance, that the state is back. It is very clear. The state is back, and we have to make sure the functioning of the state is upgraded and is, let's say, part of the solution. And therefore, I am actually proposing the neo-Bavarian state model. So it's not a classical bureaucratic thinking, it's actually hierarchy as a driver for our systems in a democratic state of law. It probably, I put it as a hypothesis here, creates stability, more stability than just markets and just networks. It creates a bit more certainty, which is also needed. It creates the chances to have some transparency in the complexity is more ensured, and it could probably also manage ambiguity in a better way. So these hierarchies, which means the public sector, organizations, and the legal frames which we need, are necessary but not sufficient. We obviously need markets, so elements of new public management and elements of new public governance, which are the networks. But it should be conditional and it should be well regulated by the public sector itself. So shifting to a neo-Bavarian state model could, I say could, because it's something we need to develop for the future, guarantee service delivery in an inclusive way, in combination simultaneously with effective handling of chronic crisis governance. And that can be fueled by innovation, constant innovation for government, by government, for society, by society. These are the three elements which we have to put on our agenda and put in our systems. To make it a bit more visible, so, and that's a kind of academic didactic tool I'm using here. So it's a governance space. You should think of in the future of a governance space where you have market mechanisms, network mechanisms, and hierarchy mechanisms, which are the legal mechanisms. And the question is, how do we use this space to run our future problems, to make sure we can solve the challenges for the future, that we are fit for purpose for the future. New public management, I think some of you will be aware of that. It has been a very pronounced model promoted by the OECD. We have the new public governance model, which is visible at levels of local government and some projects, and that's the network-driven one. And then we have the new Bavarian state, which obviously includes markets and networks, but is driven by the hierarchies. And the question is, of course, in the future, if you look at the history of public sector reforms in, let's say, Western Europe, what has been the story approximately? Of course, initially, most of you will know Weber, Max Weber, and the classical bureaucracy. I think Latin countries know it even better than Northern European countries, the classical Weberian bureaucracies. And then it became a kind of movement to say, and it has not just to do with the idea of bureaucracy, but also with the practice of bureaucracy. It got a very negative connotation. It was red tape, it was sclerosis, it was all kinds of things we didn't want. So it became dysfunctional and had a negative connotation. And so we see a kind of dialectic shift away from this hierarchy as a kind of bureaucracy, classical bureaucracy, to say we have to get rid of these bureaucracies, classical bureaucracies. And so we shifted actually to the market as a savior of our public sphere and our societies. And that was actually represented by new public management, to say we have to bring in not just market mechanisms within the public sector, but we also have to move public sector activities to the market. So the market became a kind of model to reorganize our societies and our public sector. And so the shift to the market was supposed to be functional and performing. However, we suddenly noticed that this shift to new public management in its, let's say, very pronounced way was also not solving all the problems. And we saw some failures of markets. Private monopolies emerged, and they are not always part of the solution. And so when the market takes over the systems, we saw dysfunctions. And it was very clear, even those that were very much in favor of new public management and the market mechanisms, I'm talking about OECD up to 2005. I'm also talking about the World Bank. Major development banks twisted the arm of many countries to say, if you need a bag of money, you first will bring in market mechanisms in your system and change the system to a marketized system. I think most of these big global development banks have changed their opinions here. Also, the OECD has actually corrected that to say, this is not the case anymore. We cannot just pretend to do that. There is no empirical evidence to blindly trust this. It became a kind of ideological agenda, which was dominating the facts. And so we see then from the market a way to say, we have to move to a third model. And the third model was the networks. You got it, you saw it in the UK clearly. The third way became like the heroic solution. So you see kind of from thesis to antithesis to a kind of third movement, not a synthesis, but like a third dialectic change away from the market to the networks. And the networks were supposed to save us. And the networks were emphasized. You see it in many reform agendas. In the UK, it became big society. Big society will save us. And big society was about partnerships, local government partnerships, but also the collaboration with civil society. Civil society became a crucial element in the delivery of services. So away from the public sector and its hierarchies, to the market and the private sector, to civil society and citizens who had to take their responsibility. And so you saw this shift again to say, hooray, hooray, we found a solution. Let's all move to networks and to civil society and citizens and networks who will deliver. And so this third way became a crucial element. But suddenly it became clear that the capacity was missing there, and the way of organizing this, it became very difficult to attribute responsibility and accountability mechanisms for networks. Capture became part of the elements too. And so from hierarchies to markets to networks, the question is, the networks didn't save us ultimately, even when we needed them in the crisis. COVID is an example, as I mentioned. We are shifting back as a consequence of the COVID crisis to say the state is coming back. And so we are again moving to hierarchy here to say the state and its public sector are crucial. However, not like the first version of hierarchy. We have learned, we have brought in performance from the markets. We have brought in issues of collaboration, partnerships from the networks, and we amend hierarchy with these elements. And so this is like the last shift, what we are observing now, that hierarchies come back, are recognized as part of the solution, however, amended with markets and with networks. And so what is this neo-Weberian state? So this is a kind of academic publicity way here to say, as a kind of missionary to say, well, it's not new public management that will save us. Well, it's not new public governance that will save us. You don't have to believe me, but I'm still trying to, impact your thinking to say, perhaps the neo-Weberian state could be part of the future which we need it's a democratic state with the rule of law. It's a pity we have to emphasize that, even in Europe. But I think I want to emphasize that. I think it's crucial. That's not what the market can ensure. That's not what the networks can ensure necessarily. It's about service delivery, which is open, accessible, participatory, affordable, transparent, sound, and trustworthy for all citizens. It's about responsible and accountable and significant hierarchies, organizations, and a legal frame which are proactively directing markets and networks. It's about logics of consequences. So it's about results. We have to ensure results, but we also have to ensure appropriate behavior. And appropriate behavior becomes very important for the legitimacy of our systems. It's not just individual appropriate behavior. That's corruption, for example. It's also organizational appropriate behavior. We want organizations that are responsible and transparent and citizen-oriented and focused on performance. It's also appropriate policies. It means inclusion. Policies should be inclusive. And finally, it's about thinking in a consolidated way, a whole of government. Too much we have been fragmenting the public sector, and we have seen a diversity as a consequence of new public management. Politics is not trusting administration. Minister of Finance is not trusting the line departments. Ministries are not trusting the agencies. Central government is not trusting local governments. I think we will have to go back, and it's a Weberian concept of a kind of general interest for a consolidated public sector. Civil servants have something in common, and they should be proud of it. And it's the general interest which they try to realize. And this whole of government has to be connected to a whole of society. And that becomes actually a consolidated vision to do that. Now, moving from new public management to the new public governance back to this hierarchy, neo-Weberian state, is an important element. So it's not just logics of consequences, it's also appropriateness. It's democratic collaborative governance. It's about resilience, and it's the consolidation. So let me tell you, because we are going to conclude, the assumptions here in the reform strategy here. I just will go to the implications here. It will require new public leadership. And new public leadership implies new political leadership, new administrative leadership, and new citizen leadership. And that's it. I will focus a bit now on the new administrative leadership here. What does it mean? It means that the issues of trust and legitimacy become important. It's, as I said, trust also within the public sector. And that's something we have to emphasize. We will have to communicate more and more intensively. So we will need civil servants that are able to communicate in the context of our partnerships. It will require a coordination of hierarchy with markets and networks. And so it means that civil servants not just should be legally well trained, but also be aware of how market mechanisms work and network mechanisms work. It means that we have to think in a consolidated way, not just our single organization or our level of government, but a consolidated way in the back office here. It means also that we will have to be exposed and trained in handling different data, more data and more different data in the decision making. And that's not an easy thing here. And finally, we will have to be prepared for quasi-permanent flexibility. That's a tough one, because we have to combine the routine service delivery with chronicle governance and innovations. And that will require an enormous capacity for flexibility. Let me finalize again with a poem. And I'll let you read it, and perhaps you will recognize it. My look is clear like sunflower. I have a habit of walking on the road, looking left and right, and from time to time looking back. And what I see every moment, it's what I've never seen before, and I know how to handle it very well. Actually, what I'm saying, it's for those that didn't recognize it, it's Pessoa, the herd keeper. He wrote it in 1946. Sorry, he wrote it in 1914. Perhaps Pessoa wrote this poem also for this speech here, because it's about looking around to the left, to the right, ahead of us, backward, and to see things you have never seen before, and now how to handle it. How to handle what you have never seen before requires reforms we have never seen before, and we have to have the courage to think ahead. I wish you, this is a commercial here where you can find all this information here. I wish Portugal good luck. I wish you good luck. I wish the public sector good luck. because it will be a tough road. To my students, I always say, I never promised you a rose garden. I think moving to the next stage in the public sector reform is not easy, will not be easy, but we have the duty to make it happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear Geert, for this fantastic and absolutely comprehensive approach to the main problems we face today in our societies, and namely in state and in the public administration. What a great lesson. Well, I could ask you some questions, but I can do it in other occasions, and our colleagues that are here have now this opportunity. Let's see if they profit that opportunity. And so we have still some minutes, and please, our guest is at your disposal. I know he is. So please ask whatever questions, make whatever comments you wish to do regarding what you have listened to. Please. Are there any questions here? Because if you are shy, people that are in Zoom, they are not shy. Perhaps because they are Zoom, they are not shy. And David was telling, Maria, please. Identify, I know you, but identify yourself.
Thank you very much, Professor Bouckaert. My name is Maria Asensio. I'm also guest professor here at the master's degree. It's very interesting, the position as you want for us to look at the new Bavarian state. And this is paradoxical, because for a long time we've been listening to all the critics of all the problems from the rigidities of bureaucracy. So it is interesting because it's very difficult at this moment to try to identify the whole picture, because we have, first of all, a fragmented with networked society having a voice. At the same time, the market is taking profit of all the fragility of the state. And at the end, what you are mentioning is we need to return to the role of the state to give this answer to all the problems, all the crises that you mentioned at the beginning. So which is your opinion in this fragmented configuration of the complexity role of the state? How can we look forward to find this stability? Because all these three spheres, these three different perspectives, I understand the positive and negative perspectives on the part of the state, on the network society, and also the state. But how can we have a clear picture if you put again the role of the state at the top?
Thank you very much, Maria. Do you prefer to answer immediately, or let's try to see if there are more questions here? Well, first here, you are present, so please. So you have priority. You don't use priority. So if it's so, David, if it's possible to know some questions from our friends.
Yes, from the audience that is online, there are many questions. I will start with the question of Marcia Pinheiro. that is related with the challenges that public administration is facing now regarding the digital technologies, and how can they include the citizens when we are talking about the digitalization, and also in a context of a reduction on the human resources in public administration. This is one of the questions. Another from Aníbal Magalhães is regarding to the VUCA context, and how can public administration plan better in order to reply to those challenges, and how can digitalization helps on that context. João Costa is a question: how can the artificial intelligence become a tool to be more to get a more efficient public service? What are the main risks in terms of ethics in the decision-making process? I think we can stop here because there are more questions, but we do a second round after.
And there are more questions, please.
Yes, thank you. These are all relevant questions. So to go to the first one, the state, obviously it's a kind of pure type, ideal type in the Weberian sense. So I'm not a nostalgic Weberian, let's be clear about that. So the Weberian model was, let's say, for the first half of the 20th century. We have to prepare the first half of the 21st century and the next 20 years here. So it's the point is that I have been emphasizing not Max Weber, but hierarchies. And hierarchies are really strong organizations which are legally framed in public law and with the state context, and of course in a democratic context here. And so that's still the basis which we have as a European tradition, and which we have to continue and pick up. We cannot that cannot just be guaranteed by only markets and only networks. And so my point is, we should, you've seen this pendulum I have described in moving from, let's say, bureaucracies to markets, new public management to new public governance. But I think it's important to say the lessons learned so far is that, yes, we can use markets, yes, we can use networks, but in a conditional way. And the entity that can define the conditions in a legitimate way and a legally framed way is the state. And the state ultimately has demonstrated in the COVID context that it is crucial, and we can actually, we have to, it's my proposition, we should make it happen. It is not ready at this moment, but we have to prepare for this. That's actually my point here. And so, quod erat demonstrandum, we have to make sure we can prove it in the context. The issue of the challenges of digital technology and how to include the citizens, I think there are two elements, and I will refer to the service delivery on one hand and also the crisis governance. For the service delivery, we can include in a digital way citizens to determine what kind of services that are needed when, so we can actually differentiate the delivery. We can also use digital to make decisions. I think the part of the virtual service delivery is very clear. I have been referring to teaching, but also to diagnosis and health, distance diagnosis. So there are many options here, and it will become a kind of co-production. You refer to the reduction of human resources. I think I know that the demography of the Portuguese civil service in the next 10 years will change dramatically. I mean, the reduction, people that will retire in the next 10 years, it's immense. And of course, then you will have to ask two questions. Will you replace each civil servant by another one, or will it be, you know, with a reduction, if it's possible, because we have to be careful not to go be subcritical. But the crucial point is, how can you use this as a kind of opportunity to change the nature of your civil service and the set of competences and skills for the future? And so I think this in French and Canada, they call it la relève. So how can we replace our civil servants in the next 10 years who leave the system by the skills we need for the future? And I think that will be, that's a fundamental question, but it's actually an opportunity which should be taken here. The issue of VUCA, which then refers to the crisis part, how can public administration plan better? I think it's very clear in the climate debate that the increasing number of data we can collect to anticipate disasters is there, and of course earthquakes are still difficult to predict, but in a way the other and fires are, you know, is a Poisson distribution when it happens, unless it's a kind of criminal activity of putting fire there. But also here we will have to change our urban planning systems in a way to better grasp the risks and the uncertainties. But it's very clear that through databases we should be able to better predict what is coming on. I think for climate, it's very clear the capacity of models to predict the weather forecast, for example, is very impressive. And we already have better views on how the sea and the warm waters are changing. And I think from that point of view, I'm not pessimistic. So science will actually be part of the solution here. And the last part is on artificial intelligence and the risks and the ethics. I mentioned to the algorithms, there already have been famous cases where algorithms have been including biases which are absolutely unacceptable and unethical. And I think I am in favor of our audit offices to focus on the digital capacity, the quality of databases, the quality of algorithms, and the use of all the tools of artificial intelligence, which I think we have to use, but it should be shaped, and there should be a legal framework for that, and there should be a technical check that it's compatible with our policies.
Okay, I will try to synthesize because we have many people online and many questions also, so I will try to be synthetic. Marta Quadros asks, in a context where Portuguese public administration is very bureaucratized with many laws and not always up to date, how can we change to this neo-Weberian state with the low number of human resources, some of them not qualified, and when the resources are not so available? How can we make innovations in this context? António José de Oliveira asks about some Lipovetsky approach when Facebook likes and nothing else matter. How do you implement a long-term structuring measures? Elizabeth Raposo asks about how can we change from the actual paradigm when political decisions are not able to do that. They have to be prepared, and not only civil servants. It is an issue also of political decisions, and also about the capability of human resources in public administration. To finalize, because we have many questions arriving, I think we cannot have time to all of them, and some of them are in Portuguese, which takes more difficult to me to translate directly. So last one about Carla Sofia Farinha. How can Portuguese bureaucracy lead and live up to innovations and challenges taken in the age of competencies regarding human resources issues? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for all the questions, and I'm sorry we can't handle all of them, but perhaps we should find a virtual way with capacity to answer them. So but let me go through quickly to the 4 questions you have raised. I think on the bureaucracy and the shift to the neo-Weberian state, I think one of the crucial disciplines which we have been neglecting a bit in the reform strategy is the legal profession and the legal discipline. And we see a change. We see law faculties which are changing their nature as law faculty. And what you see is that in many law faculties, I'm not sure about the Portuguese law faculties, but the law faculties in some countries are changing their nature in the way that they are including social sciences. And so we need lawyers for the future who understand social sciences and which focus on the effectiveness of law. So not just the legal closed system, but actually how can law as an instrument be effective in for policies and for society. And so obviously we have principles of the rule of law, but to include social sciences could be one of the ways to change and make the legal profession fit for purpose in the debate we just had. And that I think that's an important one. We have to bring back the lawyers to a certain extent, but we have to change the lawyers first. And the lawyers have to change themselves as a discipline and thinking in terms of social sciences, because they are part of social sciences. I think the Portuguese bureaucracy, actually, that's the same question, the last question. I think to the extent that law is important, we have to change the competences of the people that study law and the functionality of law to shape and be better part of a solution here and of a changing system here. Politics is crucial. How can we change the paradigm with the politics? I think that's a tough question, and it has to do with this tension between politics and society, politics and administration. But I do observe that it's perhaps going slowly, and polarization doesn't always help. But I do see shifts in political think tanks that are convinced that we have to move in certain directions. So we can only hope that political academies, political academies, and the new generation of politicians are perhaps more fit for purpose to do that. So it's a kind of voluntaristic and optimistic thing, which is perhaps more wishful thinking than reality, but it's something we have to hope here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geert. I think we have no more time. But to say that it was interesting is not enough. When we listen to your explanation, for instance, regarding the new Weberian state, we face something that seems it will be eventually possible in the future, but something that is it will be very difficult to build. So I think it's particularly interesting in your perspective is that you make a wonderful diagnostic and you say what are possible interesting solutions, and then you have the model of new Weberian state. But what is more interesting, I think it's what it is behind that. And what it is behind that it's an utopia. You are a man of utopias, Professor Geert Bouckaert, and coordinated a great book with different perspectives regarding utopia some years ago. Okay, now the new Bavarian state, I would say it's not an utopia, no, something that it's possible to build, but indeed behind that there is a nice utopia about what could be our future if people wanted to build that future, if people, and our democratic countries, we are always speaking about that small part of the world, of course, but anyway, if people wanted to participate in decision making, if people were prepared to accept the changes, but they were also able to accepting these changes, to manage those changes in order to objectives that are of public interest, let's say like this. So thank you very much, Geert. It was wonderful, always wonderful. That is true. I think we have here some of your students. You can say yes, but we know it's like this. It was a great opportunity to have Professor Geert Bouckaert here, not only here this time, with lots of people listening to this outside, but last week teaching in the context of the Master in Public Administration. I think I can tell that Professor Geert Bouckaert will come back, and that we'll have other occasions to listen to him, to learn with him, and then to discuss a bit more with him. That today there was not time enough to discuss all the interesting ideas you presented. And let me tell you, you are a revolutionary, dear Geert. Curiously, what you said today, it will be, in a certain sense, a revolution, a curious revolution in a very different way. If we think about usually what it is, our notion of revolution, the revolution of the new Weberian state, it is the revolution of the rule of law, the state back, and something new about all this. A different approach to the state, to the rule of law, but state and the rule of law and public interest. Old words. The words we hope, will be words for the future too. So, to finalize again, thank you very much, my dear friend. It was very, very interesting. As always, it's a pity that we can't go on, but so it is. We'll have other opportunities. Thank you very much.
Obrigado.